Hello, folks, and welcome to this Coda episode on the Punic Wars, in which we're going to step back a little bit and look at some of the things Rome destroyed and how they destroyed them, and how they used this destruction as a weapon of terror for future generations. Because that's where we're going with this, folks. Rome is about to become a bit of a menace. And this is the moment, not that Rome began to become a menace, but rather that the true weight of the menace became apparent to the world outside of the Western Mediterranean. Oh, pardon me, my fashion's not quite as on point as it usually is. The migraines are severe and screen is an issue, so hence the fancy red glasses here. Okay. Without any further ado, then, I am going to introduce you to Archimedes of Syracuse, R.I.P. Archimedes, and then we're going to talk about the Roman triumph. Syracuse, as you'll remember, is a city-state on the island of Sicily. Now, Syracuse wasn't part of the Carthaginian Empire. It was its own city-state that, during different periods, controlled larger or smaller bits of the island of Sicily itself. It was a Greek-speaking city-state. It had a variety of tyrants, including this dude Agathocles, who was an amazing character that we do not have time for currently, but like Google him if you want to read some Game of Thrones level nonsense. We're not talking about him today, though. We're talking about Archimedes, a much more wholesome sort of, well, it's harder to get less wholesome than Agathocles, inventor and scientist, because warfare isn't just about destroying large amounts of stuff. It's also about innovation and engineering. And with the engineering of warfare, we also get to meditate on the ethics of engineering. Those of you who haven't heard of Archimedes, this is like the ancient world's version of Leonardo da Vinci. So this is like Leonardo da Vinci 1.0. There's a rap battle in here somewhere. Should you record one, I would consider that for extra credit. Right. This is an overhead view of Syracuse, both an artist's recreation of the ancient city-state and a topographical map. As you can see, like a lot of other ancient cities, there's a high peak, the Acropolis, and then there's a harbor downwards on the slope. What makes Syracuse Harbor particularly nice, though, is that it's got this barrier island complex that eventually gets joined to the mainland, creating this deep sea-breaking harbor that has the capacity for deep draft boats, and it's a major trading hub coming from the eastern Mediterranean to the western Mediterranean, which is why, even though Syracuse as a city-state isn't huge, it is incredibly wealthy and powerful, and this is part of how it manages to maintain its hold on its territory while Carthage and Rome is going back and forth across the landscape. During the Second Punic War, this dude Archimedes, who was native to Syracuse, was responsible for innovating in order to create a defense against Roman forces attacking through the harbor. Archimedes' task, in part, was to create ways to defend the seawall and prevent Rome from successfully entering the city. So let's see how this worked. Okay, we start with the controversy. So this is Archimedes' so-called death ray, and this is not just me being histrionic, this is what people actually call it. More sober military historians call it the heat ray. I prefer death ray because why not be epic? We're in the ancient world, like, can't we have fun? The concept behind the death ray goes as follows. Archimedes had soldiers on the walls of Syracuse polish the insides of their shields, and we're to imagine a hoplon. In this case, bronze hopla is the plural of hoplon. And they were polished so that they could reflect the intense rays of the Mediterranean sun off of the parabolic interior of the shield and then down into the harbor, where multiple shields would focus beams of light at the ships currently attacking. This would, of course, be the Roman fleet. So again, according to the historians and several tactical manuals from the ancient world, if done successfully, you would all concentrate your sunbeams onto the wood of the Roman fleet, which would have been wood sealed with pitch, mind you. So even though it's kind of damp wood, it's soaked in accelerants. So theoretically, enough solar power directed at a small enough point on a ship would cause that ship to catch on fire. As those of you who are fans of Mythbusters will be more than aware, people have been trying to reproduce this effect with varying degrees of success over the years. Most of these attempts have been complicated somewhat by iffy methodology. Maybe if you have some extra bronze laying around and an URA proposal ready on hand, this would be a really good URA project to see if you yourself can create an Archimedes death ray. But the idea and the historical memory, or at least urban legend, if this never happened or was a thing, was a big enough mental image, at least, that we have manuscripts like the one you see on the lower image. So right here, this manuscript author has given us a seawall. It's more like a medieval seawall, and it's aiming a death ray at a very medieval-looking cog with an incredibly medieval-looking bit of glass lens, and there's only one, so the artist is not following the brief very well. But this is medieval fan art, and if you remember the elephant that the medieval artist tried to draw back in the Alexander lecture, yeah, the Middle Ages, it was a fun time. I am going to say, I'm not one of those who's going to dump on the Middle Ages, though. The Middle Ages gets a bad and entirely undeserved and unfair rap for its science and technology. The medieval period in all branches of science and technology was advanced from the ancient world. So, like, that nonsense about the Middle Ages being this horrible step back where everything was shitty, I shouldn't cuss on these lectures, but why stop now? Is nonsense. It's slanderous nonsense invented by Renaissance people to make themselves feel better about themselves. And quite frankly, that is beneath all of us. So stop dumping on the Middle Ages. There's also not a little bit of Islamophobia involved there, because many of the advances in the medieval world were being made through the Arabic universities, especially Baghdad. So, but not solely though. Medieval Europe, not a wasteland of tumbleweeds and reactionaryism. In fact, a lot of lady scientists in the medieval period. Google Hildegard of Bingen. Okay, sorry, done, rant over. Onto the death ray. More death ray. Behold, the MIT death ray, which I'm including because this is the most successful, although still flawed, attempt to create one of these doohickeys to date. So this was made using an array of parabolic mirrors arranged across the top of a parking structure on the MIT campus at a reproduction of an ancient ship hull, complete with pitch sealant and pine beams. Like, it's the ship pretty dead on. It's also painted black. That was the reason why ancient ships were a dark color, is the black of the pitch pine, which enhances the heat and also creates a, well, as I mentioned, it's an accelerant, yes? So the MIT death ray, even with lackluster Michigan cloudy sunlight, was able to set a hull on fire within a few minutes. I think the time from unveiling the mirrors to the ignition of the model ship was 4 minutes, if I remember correctly. So this is at least theoretically possible. Take that, Mythbusters. However, these mirrors are not made out of polished bronze, so there is some work left to be done on this problem. So I will fully admit, my geeky side really, really wants this to be an actual thing that at least one person made work one time in the ancient world, but the honest professional historian part of me has to admit that maybe this one's an urban legend. Maybe not, though. If you know somebody with the TARDIS, I have questions. Hook me up, guys. Mr. Spouse, the engineer, points out that I just called the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Michigan, and as Ohio State alums, that's kind of a hanging offense. So A, don't turn me into the Alumni Association, and B, please forgive my blasphemy against the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. You see, that's why, because I can't say Massachusetts. Massachusetts.
Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the most revered of all institutions of higher education, particularly in engineering.
Okay.
Along with Caltech,
and
Stanford.
UMBC. Shh. Okay, right. We were talking about ways to mess with people trying to attack your seawall, and here we're on to more firm ground. This is the Archimedes claw. Maybe not as cool of a name as the Archimedes death ray, but it's really up there. It's very Bond villain. Or is that Inspector Gadget? Oh dear. All right, thank you. So this is basically a glorified crane that we're looking at here. We're using the top of the seawall as a fulcrum point and attaching pulleys onto the back end, using this to operate the crane mechanism. Now this was put on a rotating base, a lot like the Corvus, similar principle here, so that you could aim this crane at the ships that had gotten a little bit too close to your seawall. On the seaward side of this crane, there is what amounts to a giant fishhook kind of deal. Hi, kitty. Hi. Thank you. So this fishhook dangles in the water, and you're kind of playing a high-stakes game of, like, pull the stuffed animal out of the claw mechanism thing here, where you try to hook the bottom of this claw underneath the ram end of the ship's prow. You can't really grab onto an ancient warship's stern, remember, because the stern curves up at this very slippery angle. So in order to grab the keel properly, you need to get this around the ram. So once hooked, you use the pulley system to quickly raise the claw, thus lifting the ship out of the water. And this is going to be particularly catastrophic because the ship, as this one does here, if they're trying to board your walls, they're going to have a mobile siege tower attached to the front of their ship. So they're already going to have their weight massively off kilter a bit. So they're top heavy, they're in a vulnerable position, they're too close to your wall, and you're grabbing them by the keel beam. So what you do is you pull it up into the sky. The Marines, of course, start skittering off the back of the ship. Everybody's in chaos, the tower falls over, and then you just let it go, as in illustration number 3. At this point, the ship goes right down into the water. If you're really lucky, you crack the keel beam, but even if you don't, you're going to be causing chaos. Everybody drops their oars, the ship's planks break. This is going to cause catastrophic damage to the ship and create a massive shipwreck right where the other Romans need to be to board your walls. So you do this enough times, and you're going to create this floating mess of broken ship parts and screaming sailors and debris that are going to severely impact the ability of the enemy to enter your city. Pretty nifty, huh? So, all good things must come to an end. And as you may recall, who wins the Second Punic War, right? This is Second Punic. Romans. Romans win the Second Punic War, including the Battle of Syracuse. Because, as you may recall from previous lectures, the Romans are really persistent. In fact, if I were to name perhaps the one factor responsible for Roman success after luck. They got very lucky, but also they were bloody minded in their persistence. So they managed to invade Syracuse, and here's where things go haywire. Now, the Roman army, which was under the command of Scipio at the time, was under orders to find Archimedes and bring him alive back to Rome so he could make his devious war machines for Rome. Because remember, Rome is into sustainability where military inventiveness comes, right? They liked to grab your inventions and use them. Gold star, I guess. Alas, this is not how this story ends. So one centurion, and I'm sure he never lived this down. I don't know if we have his name or not. It's probably best for his memory's sake that we don't. Comes into this room where he sees this old guy at his sand table working on some equations. And he's like, dude, hands up, you're under arrest. And the guy is like, man, hold on a minute, I'm almost done. I like doing stuff. I live with an engineer. This is pretty accurate.
Oh, I'm the one that has to put down stuff.
Okay, fine. We're married for a reason, okay? Right. So Archimedes, probably not neurotypical either, because goddamn. So the centurion busts in. Archimedes refuses to put down his math instruments, and the centurion kills him. He killed frickin' Archimedes. Idiot. Like, don't kill mathematicians in their own home. Just stop. Don't do that.
There's a lot of mathematicians that deserve it.
Hey, no, some of my students are mathematicians. Don't talk like that.
I'm just saying.
Dude, I'm not re-recording this slide.
Okay.
I do not endorse Mr. Spouse's opinion
That
on...
department was the most dysfunctional department at Ohio State.
Shh. Some of my best friends are mathematicians.
Yes.
Look,
they're weird.
Nobody deserves to be murdered in their own workroom.
True.
Okay, great.
Murder back.
Next slide. This lecture is long. Okay, so now that we've murdered Archimedes, let's talk about what happens if you're not a scientist and the Romans capture you. I don't know why I'm making this just about Romans. Look up what we did with Nazi scientists after World War II. We hired them. That's what we did. At any rate, on to the Roman triumph. Now, here we are looking at the keynote speaker of this Roman ritual of warfare. This is from the monumental arch of Marcus Aurelius, showing Marcus Aurelius, of course, the emperor, all in state in his triumphal chariot, enjoying the moment of his victory. Kind of a questionable one, Pannonia, but on we go. The Roman triumph was a ceremonial parade that the Senate could vote you if you had been deemed to have won a victory impressive enough for the state to officially recognize it. This was, yes, about rewarding successful military leaders, and that's part of the dynamic here, but I'd like to focus not on the general's point of view in this moment, because from a military history point of view, and even from a why did Romans do this point of view, that misses the point a little bit. Because the Roman triumph was one of the most valuable weapons of terror in the Roman arsenal, because it was a ceremony of ritual humiliation and ritual murder of Rome's enemies for the pleasure of the Roman onlooker. And this is something that has a deep and pervasive impact on how people in leadership positions reacted to Roman conquest and Roman success as Rome's influence began to widen and as more and more rulers had to think about, what will I do if I'm on the wrong end of a Roman victory? So without any further ado, let us unpack this horrible, horrible experience. So just put yourself in this position. You're not Roman. You're, say, Jugurtha, king of Numidia, or you're one of the city fathers of Carthage, or you're Vercingetorix up in Gaul. the Romans have succeeded in their campaign against you. They've captured you alive, and they've brought you home in chains to Rome. Now, this doesn't always happen at once. The Senate has to vote the general a triumph. The general has to be there for it. Rome has to be stable enough to afford it. So you could be kept for years on end awaiting this moment, just sitting there doing nothing but waiting to, well, spoilers. This is the parade route, and this is coming in from the Field of Mars. Campus Martius is Field of Mars in Latin. And this was where the Roman army at one point used to train. As the Roman army gets bigger as an institution, not so much of this happens on the Field of Mars. It becomes reserved for the cavalry trials of Roman elites, so it becomes a bit of a vanity field. This is also the field on which Romans vote. There's a lot of ritual significance. So during a triumph, this is where the victorious army prepares for the procession. So this is one of the only situations in which a Roman army is legally allowed to be all banded together with their weapons, is just for this triumphal procession day. This is because if the Roman army is there with weapons and not authorized to be there, they're probably in the middle of a military coup. That's not theoretical. This happens a lot in like the next century after the Punic Wars. So that's nice. Okay, you come in through the Gate of Triumph, the Porta Triumphalis, this monumental gate into the city of Rome. And it's not just the army. There are parade floats that have heaped up all of the fanciest wealth that was looted from the country that has just been sacked. So your country's most sacred treasures, your most prized possessions are all on parade floats with little like signs telling the onlookers where it's from and what it's for and how awesome Rome is for capturing this stuff. So like your entire cultural heritage is now on display. See also British Museum and the Met. Just, putting that out there. That's not all, though. People who have been captured during this war, the very, very good looking ones, the men of fighting age, are in chains with this kind of theater of conquest. So it's not enough that you're defeated, you're dressed up in chains and marched through the streets of Rome along the parade route in this kind of ritual humiliation. So the end of your fight of resistance against Rome, trying to keep them from taking your dang country, mind you, is going to be you in chains with what's left of the people in your unit marching through this route, at the end of which you're either going to be forced to fight with other people from your country in gladiatorial competitions because you're now enslaved and you don't get to say what happens to you, or you're going to be sold to somebody, or you're going to be kept as property of the state and forced to dig minerals out of unsafe mining situations until you die horribly, either of a cave-in or heavy metal toxicity, because mining is full of like arsenic and lead, you know. Or you'll be sold to a private owner who will use you to farm a large factory farm, say, or for sex work, which is what happened to a lot of the people, all people who were captured, but particularly young ones, women. You're gonna likely end up being trafficked as well as having your labor abused until the end of your life. And this is not even the first step, this is the middle step of that process, where everybody watches as this happens to you, including your leaders, because your leaders are in pride of place right before the general. You'll have a parade float where your kings, your officials, your priests, every important person they can get their hands on. And for Carthage, that's a lot, because Carthage, like Rome, is ruled by an elected senate. So Carthaginian senators, highborn noble people, including highborn noble women, they're on these floats too. All of them being marched through the streets of Rome and having things thrown at them, people yelling at them. That is one of the last things you see if you're in a leadership position because of where this parade ends. So you walk through the Forum and the Palatine area through the major religious heart of Rome, ending up at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. The top of the Capitoline Hill has the temple to Jupiter, and it's the major temple of Rome. Victorious general goes up there and sacrifices, but at the foot of this temple is... Welcome to the Mamertine prison and the Tullianum. So this is your last stop if you are an enemy leader being brought through a Roman triumph. The procession stops long enough to lower you into the Mamertine prison, and the Mamertine prison itself, carcere is the Latin word for prison, hence incarcerate is to put somebody in one of these doohickeys. Now, prison in the ancient world wasn't the kind of prison industrial complex we think about today. There were places that served that function in the penal systems of the ancient world, but they would have been more like labor camps or prison mines. For prisons that were like locks and bars and enclosures, they were used as pretrial holding for people who couldn't find somebody to monitor them under house arrest, or they were used as a place to lock up a family member as collateral to make other people pay a debt. So like prison for debt was a thing, still is a thing. This is one level of toxic. Farther than that, though. So if you were just being held awaiting trial, you'd be in the basement carcere, this main area. But you'll notice there's this area below the jail itself called the Tullianum. Inside of it, there's a well shaft, which is kind of perverse because you really shouldn't be drinking the water in here. So this was an area where enemy generals and condemned prisoners of a high enough standing were taken, ritually strangled, and their bodies were left there. So no burial is part of the deal. And that's part of the ritual humiliation here. So if the Romans capture you alive, they let you rot in prison until it's time for the parade. Then you're taken through the streets of Rome, put into a hole in the ground, strangled, and then your body left unburied, which is a big deal in the ancient Mediterranean. If you don't get burial rights, this messes up your afterlife for most Mediterranean people. So not only is your body desecrated, but your soul is left to wander the earth, perhaps without end. I've been to this place, and I'm not sure if I believe in haunting, but if some place is haunted, this is the place. Interestingly, it's also a church now because of one of its most famous inmates. That is the Apostle Paul. Yeah, he got shoved here for a bit until the emperor declined to hear his case, and then he just ends up hanging out in Rome until he dies. Because he has Roman citizenship, so it's actually kind of a good story for him. Not so great for most people who end up here. It's honestly, I find it a very upsetting place to think about, and I'm not ashamed of that. I think it's good for us to feel upset by this kind of thing. Astute observers will notice this is not an ancient image. This is a still from HBO's Rome, where Ciarán Hinds, playing Gaius Julius Caesar, is a triumphing general, as indeed Caesar was. Now, during his period, the red face paint had stopped being a thing, but in early Roman triumphs, Pliny the Elder tells us, triumphing generals would paint their face and their hands red as a symbol of the blood shed in the service of Rome. However, the red theme was part of the costume, so Roman generals in a triumph were some of the only people allowed to wear a deep red purple dyed toga embroidered with gold. So this was called the toga palmata. For those of you who like these terms, you don't have to know that word later. But it's this fancy gold embroidered toga that you wear with a victor's crown on your head. Behind him, you'll see this guy holding yet another crown over his head. This was an enslaved person who would, at regular intervals during the course of the parade, say into the general's ear, "Remember, you're only mortal." The idea behind this was that the honor of a triumph was felt to be dangerous in that it could inflate the ego of an already egomaniacal general and give them the idea that it was acceptable and appropriate not just to conquer not Romans, but to, well, try to take over the state. Romans were quite paranoid about this. Turns out for good reason. See Augustus. So, by having an enslaved person reminding you that you're not a god, you're just mortal, it's not just about the reminder, it's about the person. Enslaved people included all sorts of prisoners of war, including enemy generals who weren't killed in the ceremony. Often high ranking people or sons of famous families would be kidnapped, enslaved, and made to live as part of Roman households. They were a prestige item, and that's likely the kind of person who'd be tapped for this job here. So this is somebody who very well could have been of the same social status as the general himself in his own country. So part of his presence there is not just to be like, "Hey, you can die," just friendly reminder, but it's also like, "Hi, I, here, an enslaved person, am your possible future if you don't watch it, if you get cocky, if you forget that even a successful general tomorrow may lose." That's the register of the warning here. This is meant to remind the general of the fleetingness of success. And it tells you something about Roman psychology, too. Um, they were aware that the more success they had, the more they had to lose. And this was something, a paranoia that they tried to build into their psychological architecture, particularly elite Romans who would be commanding armies. And I think this has a lot to do with the kinds of decisions we see being made in Roman history. Oh, yeah, one last thing I want to say about this. Our tour guide from the ancient world for this section of the course has been Polybius. And as you recall, Polybius is one of these war captives. He was from a high-ranking not Macedonian, Greek family. And he was taken as a young man as a prisoner of war, as a hostage. And Polybius was living in Rome in part to threaten his family into compliance with Rome. So if Polybius's family ever took up arms against Rome again or ever, Polybius's life would be forfeit. And that's how Polybius ends up in Scipio's household. He's not a disinterested observer. He's a prisoner of war who's not there voluntarily. That's why he's writing in Greek and why he's writing to a Greek audience. But there's also a little bit of Stockholm syndrome going on with Polybius, I think, although that might be a bit dismissive, but I think it's a fair analysis of Polybius's dynamic. He's taken as a young person and made to live in Rome. And in order to survive that situation, he's got to do this complicated balancing act between identifying with the people who he's living with, the Romans, the family of the Scipios, and with his family, his family who are being held captive by the existence of Polybius. And if you're interested in exploring this dynamic further, there's a series up on Netflix. Barbarians is about another such prisoner of war in Rome, a guy named Arminius. He was a German, and he decides that this is not a cool dynamic with interesting results. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but if you Google Quinctilius Varus, you'll have an idea of where this ends. Death. Lots of death. A triumphing general had one last mark that he got to leave on the city of Rome. But this too isn't just a monument. This is also a persistent prop in Rome's dominance game. So here we're looking at the Arch of Titus. This is a little bit of foreshadowing too. Our last unit, we're going to be talking about the conflict that created this monument. That is the defeat of Judea and the sack of Jerusalem in 70 CE. So this is the memorial from the triumph that resulted from that conflict. Now, you'll notice this is an arch just kind of out there in the middle of the road, and that's exactly what this is. This is a giant archway that's not supporting a building. It's there just to be an arch over the road. So why is this here, you may ask? Well, to understand this, we need to talk about battlefield rituals engaged in by Romans. Other people in the Mediterranean did this too, but Romans really went for it in a big way. At the end of a battle, when the opposing side had surrendered, and this is anybody who surrendered rather than die, and a lot of people would kill themselves or kill each other to avoid this part of the battle too, and Romans victim shamed you if you didn't, so it is not to be looked at as a voluntary suicide. It's not. This is most definitely a no-win scenario end game that Rome is trying to get you to play. So, if you surrender to Rome, they'd make you go under the yoke. A yoke is an agricultural implement used to link two oxen or other draft animals together in order to pull a plow or a cart or some kind of vehicle. You don't really do this with horses. You need a lighter, horses do have a yoke, it's just lighter. But an agricultural yoke has to be heavier because oxen are heavier pulling animals, and the plow is a different kind of weight. So it's a block of wood cut in a shape like this, kind of like an M-shaped block. And you can't have a single arch yoke too. More than two is a little bit silly. So this would be held by two soldiers on either side, and then captives would be forced to bend over almost all the way to the ground and walk under this yoke. If they didn't have a literal agricultural yoke, they would do this by holding a pair of spears across a walkway, kind of like a twisted, evil limbo. Except you didn't bend backwards, you bent forwards, so almost onto your knees. So what's the point of this? Well, oxen are animals that pull a plow. They are possessions. They are for labor. You can use them however you want. They have no legal protections. They have no personhood. They are subjected to whippings and to punishment, much like enslaved people. So if this seems like a symbolic transition of human beings from human beings to animals, it's not quite so symbolic in the Roman mindset. And this is one of the many reasons why slavery is an obscene affront to human rights. It's so obscene that some Romans had a problem with it. This isn't just me picking on ancient people who didn't know better. Ancient people, many of them did see a problem with this. It's just when oppression is systemic, it is the work of centuries, unfortunately, to dismantle it, which is not to say we should not do it. We absolutely should dismantle toxic systems of oppression, in my opinion. I mean, I don't want to tell you what to think, but god damn it. At any rate, that's what this is about. But it doesn't stop on the battlefield. This is why the triumphal arch is the shape it is. Every time you walked under this arch, you were walking underneath the very literal power of the Roman state. And this isn't just me speculating as a modern historian. Ancient people felt this way, so much so that Talmudic scholars tell us, and it was tradition for Jews living in the city of Rome or visiting, as they did. Rome had one of the largest populations of Jewish people outside of Jerusalem. It's like Alexandria, then Rome are the two largest Jewish communities in the ancient Mediterranean. Eventually, Carthage catches up too. So if you were a Jewish person living in the city of Rome after this arch went up, you would avoid walking through it, and you had to avoid it because it's on a major road. It's on the sacred road, the same road that's the parade route for triumphal processions. So you'd have to go out of your way to walk around it. It would be difficult and inconvenient, but you would do that in order to show that you were still not submitting to Roman control. And in this story, I find a kernel that later grows into a movement. Because remember, Rome as a political entity doesn't last forever, and people whom Rome possessed, or oppressed rather, eventually move out of it and find, well, other ways to oppress people. Yeah, the Stockholm Syndrome really goes quite deep, Britain. But there is some hope in this too, that nobody can sustainably and forever make other people do stuff for them, at least without some concessions, I guess. Look, it's 2020. I take my hope where I can. So what was the effect of this culture of degradation and terror on Roman foreign policy and Roman military policy? We're going to choose as our illustrative story here one of the most tragic moments from the Second Punic War. And this is a love story between King Massinissa of Numidia, and Sophonisba is the name that we get for her from Latin sources. We think that her name in Carthaginian would have been Sapanabaal. The Baal is from Baal, one of the major gods of Carthage, and I'm going to use that name for her, even though I stumble over the pronunciation a bit, but it's the least I can do. Her fiance, as I said, was Massinissa, and you may recall from the historical bit of this unit that one of the major coups Scipio managed to achieve in the final segments of the Second Punic War was getting the Numidian cavalry to switch sides. So Massinissa agreed to join with Scipio and to dump Hannibal and thus turn against Carthage. This was a major factor responsible for Hannibal's defeat at the Battle of Zama. In his negotiations with Scipio, Massinissa begged that Scipio would spare the life and the dignity of Sapanabaal, his fiancé. And according to most sources, and I'm going to put my hesitation in here because, again, we're hearing from Polybius, who's got some bias issues, and later from Livy, who has more bias issues. But at any rate, so the story goes, Massinissa was promised Sapanabaal's life. So their engagement was broken off. Their love was not to be. It was part of the price of Massinissa's side switching, because Sapanabaal was Carthaginian from a noble family, and her family was quite powerful, as was she. Cool thing about the Carthaginians, lots of powerful women involved in their politics. At the fall of Carthage, Sapanabaal was captured, and Scipio decided that she was going to be part of the triumph. And at this point, Massinissa is stuck, because he's made his deal. He can't, like, back out of his arrangement with Scipio now that the war's over and he's switched sides. Like, it's way too late. And also, like, if you turn on the Romans, you might end up dead in the basement. So he decides, and this is the part that's going to be, again, about, this isn't really, there's suicide and then there's enforced self-murder, and this is more enforced self-murder. Massinissa manages to get to Sephanabal the mean poison enough that she can take her own life and thus avoid being ritually murdered by the Romans in the context of a triumph. And she takes it, thus dies, and thus deprives Scipio of the ability to display her in the triumph. But with this moment and this act of defiance, I don't think she's the first person to do this, but it's a bit of a trend-setting moment because she's not the last foreign monarch to choose their one last opportunity to stick it to the Romans. That is, to kill themselves and deny the Romans the pleasure of killing you in an embarrassing subbasement. This is what ends up happening with King Mithridates VI of Pontus. Poor King Mithridates, according to legend, had immunized himself against poison by taking a little bit of it every day. Note, this doesn't work for heavy metals, but for botanical poisons, which were some of the most reliable methods to kill yourself quickly in an emergency situation, you can immunize yourself to. Don't try it. Please don't try it. And yeah, this is where Princess Bride got the idea. So he couldn't take poison. He tried, it didn't work, and so he ends up having to use a sword. Cleopatra VII, on the other hand, the poison does work. By the way, the snake, that's a myth. Uh, where the snake comes from, you may have heard that Cleopatra VII killed herself by getting bitten by a snake. However, she was too smart for that, and also the earliest sources don't say that. They actually say, no, it wasn't a snake. Because snakes don't always have the same amount of poison in their poison sacs, and a snake can choose not to inject poison into you when it bites, especially adult snakes. So even if it bites you, you're not going to get a full dose of poison reliably. So snakes are a horrible way to don't kill yourself, but also don't use a snake. Instead, the earliest sources say, and this is the version accepted by historians, and I'm not saying most historians, I'm saying reputable historians. This is accepted canon fact in ancient history circles, so you can be super insufferable about this at parties from now on. She hid poison in her hair comb that she took the first moment she was unsupervised. Like, nobody bothered to check her hairdo, and she was able to take poison, die, and then Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, couldn't put her in his triumph parade. Oh no, what to do? Well, what he did was he created a fake model of Cleopatra that he put on his parade float, complete with her getting bitten by a snake because it looked better on the float. Because she was Egyptian, and the Egyptians kind of have this snake thing tied up with Egyptian pharaohs, which Cleopatra was one. This whole, like, she was Macedonian, this doesn't really count, doesn't hold water. Plenty of people from foreign dynasties ruled in Egypt. And also the Ptolemies had been local for many generations, and she was not the product of a brother-sister marriage. She was actually one of her father's concubine's children, so I'm just putting that out there. Ethnicity is complicated in the ancient world, but you can't just get out of the Cleopatra question by saying, oh, she's Macedonian, that's not really Egyptian. That's wrong on every conceivable level. Also, if you call yourself Pharaoh of Egypt and your subjects call you Pharaoh of Egypt and you speak the local language, which a lot of Ptolemies didn't, you're Pharaoh. Cleopatra was freaking Egyptian, guys, okay? All right. Sorry, very ranty lecture, isn't it? Genocide makes me ranty. So, Cleopatra not killed by snakebite. However, the fact that Cleopatra did that, and many, many other monarchs too, is a measure of just how, I'm going to go with effective, keeping in mind that I am not approving of the effectiveness. I'm just saying it was effective, this triumph as terror weapon, because it made it clear to foreign monarchs that after a certain point, your choice in the face of Roman onslaught was either to kill yourself or accept a humiliating death. And this had the effect of making people more reluctant to fight Rome, although lots of people did, and this is also a testament to their bravery. You had to be incredibly brave to stand up to Rome. And the fact that so many people over so much time did, like, kudos. Good job. You're not any less brave because it doesn't work out. And a lot of them had a really good opportunity to go for it, and eventually it does work. So just saying that. But in many of these endgame scenarios, Romans have foreign monarchs basically taking themselves out of the game entirely, which works out as a bit of a win-win for Romans. You know, the general's going to be mad because he can't have you in his triumph, but the state of Rome benefits either way. And this is also a way that the Roman people are constantly told that it is good and proper and great for Romans to go to war. And this is something Rome needed to do, because these foreign wars weren't just hurting Rome's enemies. Romans who owned farmland were being driven off of their land so that wealthy people could use enslaved labor to create mega factory farms and plantations. This meant a lot of homeless people were now in the city of Rome looking for work and unable to find work. There were generations of Romans dying abroad where their families couldn't mourn them and would never see their body again. And this was hugely traumatic. And convincing Romans to sign up for the military to go into these wars was becoming harder and harder, even in the wake of the successes of the Punic Wars. So the Roman triumph is not just about oppressing foreigners. The Roman triumph is also about convincing generations of Romans to buy into this system of violence. And that's an important thing to step back and look at too. It is all too easy to think that when Rome is winning a lot of wars and getting a lot of money for its upper class, Rome is winning. But we need to be careful about our parameters for what is win. Only on board games does the person with the most land win. If you're talking about per capita suffering, socioeconomic status, security, there were a lot of people within the citizen body of Rome who were not benefiting from this in any way other than a feeling of, our team won. And this is a dynamic that still plays out today, right? You can get people to vote and advocate against their own personal interests for reasons that have a lot to do with the team sports aspect of warfare. And this kind of dynamic also presses countries to get involved in wars that don't even benefit the state that much. All of this is to say, and this has gone to a bit of a preachy place, and it's not meant to be, all of these factors are things that are helpful to name and include in your calculations when you think about decisions, as we do in a democratic society, about how do we go to war? When do we go to war? What kind of war are we going to wage? How are we going to treat people after the war? All of these questions are questions that lead to choices that impact us as individuals and us as a society down the road for both utilitarian and moral reasons. And being able to articulate them more precisely is exactly what we need to be able to do as people in a society with a vote. Because this isn't just a problem that other people solve. You and I and our families and our friends and the people we love, all of us are making these decisions for our society. And in the wake of another election year, I think we're all feeling this responsibility at a very deep and personal level. Yeah. So being able to use history to think through our decisions today is one of the most valuable things history can do for us. So that's where I leave you guys. With one final view, this is also taken from that Arch of Titus we were looking at earlier. This image isn't from the Punic War triumphs. We don't have images of that surviving that make as good a visual as this one. This is from the sack of Jerusalem in 70 CE, and it's a permanent memorial to the triumphal parade. And this is the part of the parade where the menorah from the holiest of holies in the temple in Jerusalem was taken through the streets of Rome. Things that were considered so sacred that in some cases even the priests who managed the temple weren't supposed to look at them most days, were stripped naked and displayed for the entire Roman populace to look at and throw things at. And this gets us to the level of violation that we're talking about when we talk about the Roman triumph. And this is also a bit of a segue into our last two units, where we're going to go to the imperial period and talk about the imperial army and Roman warfare on an industrial international scale. This rather begins with the Punic Wars, and it reaches its zenith in Roman Britain and also in Roman Judea. So stay tuned for the depressing yet very interesting conclusions of warfare. Later, guys. Have a lovely Thanksgiving, which is pretty on brand for this lecture, isn't it? Okay. Try not to spread the pandemic. Take care of your people. I'm thinking of you kindly. Till next time.